The flute of champagne warmed in my hand. I hadn't taken a sip. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't trust myself not to throw it. The ballroom shimmered in gold and crystal. Cascade Hotel, downtown Seattle. 80 guests. One anniversary cake, and one woman who never wanted me here. I just needed a moment. So I stepped into the hallway and heard everything. "Leave you, lowlife." Her voice was sharp, slurred with vintage wine. I froze. My name wasn't spoken, but every word had my shape. Patricia Morgan. James's mother. Still in her navy sequin dress. Still holding court like royalty. Still believing her money gave her the right to humiliate. 12 years. 12 years I sat at her table, smiled through her cuts. 12 years of paying for her daughter's tuition, her son's hospital bills. 12 years of proving I belonged. And tonight I was still the outsider. I pressed my hand against the cool wallpaper. The laughter inside the ballroom echoed like a dare. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even when James found me minutes later asking if I was okay. I lied. And I left. Packed my dress, left my ring. Wrote him a note on hotel stationery. When silence says everything, don't speak. Then I flew. To Maui. To the house I bought with my own money. To the waves that never judged me. At 3:20 p.m. I streeted on the porch barefoot. Coffee in hand. Hair undone. No pearls, no performance. Just me. The woman she called Lowlife. The woman who built a $12 million design firm from a studio apartment in Boise, and for the first time in years I breathed without apology. She had all the chandeliers. I had the sun. Would you have stayed and confronted her, or walked away and let the silence speak for you? Where are you listening from? Have you ever been dismissed by someone who should have known better? Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of quiet justice, healing, and legacy. The Denver sun spilled across my kitchen like a spotlight I hadn't asked for. It hit the marble countertops James insisted we needed for resale value, but they always felt cold beneath my fingertips. I wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee I no longer wanted. It had gone lukewarm, forgotten, like the things we used to do just because we loved each other. There was lipstick on the rim. Not new. Not fresh. Just a reminder I used to try. The house was too quiet now. Just the low hum of the fridge and the tick of the antique clock his mother gave us. Every corner felt full of memory. But none of it felt like mine anymore. On the wall beside the pantry hung our family photo, me in navy, James in gray, Patricia beaming like she was queen of something. I remembered that day. How she repositioned me 3 times before the photographer clicked. "Claire, tilt your chin a bit. There, that's better. Let's keep it tasteful." I'd smiled until my jaw locked. That was always her version of love. Correction. Judgment. Wrapped in pearls and perfect posture. She never shouted. She didn't need to. She has energy, I once overheard her say at a charity brunch. As if I were a puppy someone hadn't trained properly. I had to learn how to sit still. To not correct her when she mispronounced my company's name. To act flattered when she gave me unsolicited fashion advice. I told myself it was just culture clash. That James was worth it. That love could survive quiet wars. But over time I stopped laughing out loud. Stopped sketching for fun. Stopped telling stories about Spokane about my dad. Tom Morgan never met Tom Preston, my father, but I wish they had. My dad would have looked Patricia in the eye and said, "Ma'am, you don't have to understand her to respect her." Then he'd hand me a wrench and say, "Now let's fix what matters." He smelled like engine oil and cinnamon gum. Called me kiddo and boss. Never made me feel like I had to prove a damn thing. But now every time I stood in this kitchen, I felt like I was waiting for someone to hand me permission to belong. And I was so tired of waiting. Sometimes I wondered when exactly I stopped being Claire. Not just the name, but the pulse of her, the fire that used to keep me sketching until sunrise on the floor of my Boise apartment, surrounded by scraps of vellum and half-eaten takeout. Now I lived in a place where candles were only lit for dinner guests and throw pillows had to match seasonal decor. I once put a turquoise one on the couch. Patricia replaced it with beige. "It clashes," she said, folding her hands like a judge. "I know you like color, dear, but this isn't a college dorm." I remember smiling. I remember swallowing the reply that burned my throat. Every time she entered a room, I felt myself shrinking 2 inches. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. She always noticed what I lacked. The right forks, the right tone, the right lineage. James used to defend me, not with anger but with softness. "She's brilliant, Mom. You know that. She built that company from nothing. Claire has taste, it's just different." But over time, even his voice softened into silence. He stopped correcting her. He stopped seeing the sharpness in her compliments. One Christmas, I gave Patricia a hand-bound sketchbook. Custom leather. Embossed initials. Inside, I'd drawn little ink-line portraits of each family member. She opened it, flipped once, and said, "How thoughtful. I'll put this somewhere safe." She never mentioned it again. I found it a year later, wedged in the back of a bookshelf, still wrapped in its tissue paper. That's when I knew my art didn't belong here. I didn't belong here. But I stayed. Because James held my face in both hands one night and whispered, "We're not them. Don't let her win." And for a while, I believed him. I believed we were writing something new. A marriage made of ink and grit, and nights where we built dreams from nothing. But it's hard to write new chapters when someone keeps editing the margins. When your voice keeps being softened, rounded, erased, and I didn't know how to scream without sounding ungrateful. So I learned to say nothing, smile politely, offer second helpings, and pretend that being tolerated was enough. Evenings were the hardest. That's when the house went quiet and every silence felt weighted. The kind that pressed down on your chest and whispered, "This isn't home." I'd sit in the living room with my laptop open, pretending to review mock-ups for a new brand client. But I wasn't designing. I was watching the cursor blink over and over like a heartbeat with nowhere to go. Sometimes James would join me on the couch. We'd sit shoulder to shoulder, our bodies touching but miles apart. He'd scroll through emails, half listening to my updates. Nod. Smile. Go quiet again. And when I looked at him, I saw the same man I fell in love with but dimmed. There was no cruelty in him. Just quiet surrender. He wanted peace. And peace to him meant pretending Patricia's words didn't sting. "I just want everyone to get along," he once said, pouring wine like it fixed things. Does it really matter what she thinks? But it did. Not because I needed her approval, but because I deserved not to be erased. At dinner parties, I noticed the shift. How Patricia introduced me as James's wife, never as Claire Morgan, founder of a national firm. How she'd praise James's job at the tech consultancy but never ask about my latest campaign. Even when my firm landed a deal with a Fortune 100 brand, it didn't earn a single word at the family table. But when James's brother upgraded his backyard grill, she toasted him like he'd won a Nobel. Once I dared to bring it up. I said, "It feels like I'm always proving myself here." James sighed. "You don't have to. You already have. Maybe just stop letting it get to you. Stop letting it get to me." As if I could undo the tightening in my chest every time I stepped into that house. As if I could unhear the dismissals wrapped in niceties. As if dignity was something I could just stop needing. So I stopped talking about work. Stopped sharing wins. Stopped trying. And no one noticed. That hurt the most. Not the jabs, but the silence that followed them. The way indifference made me feel invisible in a room I helped light. I began waking earlier just to have the house to myself. I'd sit by the window, coffee in hand, listening to the heat pipes knock behind the walls. The sound was imperfect, raw, real. It reminded me of the shop my father built, nothing fancy but all his. Sometimes I imagined leaving, packing my laptop, my sketchbooks, the sea glass bowl from my father's shelf. Starting over somewhere warm and unapologetic. I didn't yet know it would be Hawaii. But I knew the woman I used to be, the one with color in her voice and calluses on her palms, was still somewhere inside me. She just needed space to breathe again. It started with the family group chat. A new thread popped up one Thursday afternoon: dinner this Sunday at Mom's Kai, created by James's sister Madison. I stared at the screen. 12 participants. My name wasn't one of them. At first I thought it was a mistake. An oversight. We'd hosted Thanksgiving in this house just 2 years ago. I'd folded napkins into roses. Roasted 2 turkeys because her brother didn't like dry meat. Patricia had thanked everyone, except me. Still, I asked James gently that evening. Did Maddie start a new family chat? He blinked fork midway to his mouth. Oh yeah, I think she wanted to keep it simple. Just siblings and parents, you know. But, you're married, I said quietly. So technically that includes me. He looked at me like I was being sensitive. It's just logistics, Claire. I'll forward you whatever matters. Whatever matters. As if I needed a translator to be included. As if my role now was secondary optional. Later that week, a photo was posted on Madison's Instagram. The whole Morgan family smiling in front of Patricia's piano, same living room. Same chairs I helped reupholster. Same frame, minus me. I zoomed in. There was a gap between James and his brother just wide enough for someone to have been standing there. I remembered that moment. I was there. But I had been cropped out. Literally. I didn't bring it up. What would I even say? Instead, I sat on the back porch that night wrapped in the cardigan James gave me on our 3rd anniversary and watched the lights of Denver twinkle in silence. I tried to remind myself that I was successful. That I had purpose, identity, legacy outside of this family. But in that moment, I didn't feel like a woman with a business. I felt like a placeholder in someone else's story. The house behind me buzzed with James's Zoom call. Some late-night strategy meeting. His voice used to be mine, too fast, excited, full of ideas. Now it was distant. Now it wasn't about us anymore. And I wondered, how long had I been disappearing before I noticed I was gone? A few weeks later, Patricia hosted her annual spring luncheon. It was her favorite tradition: ladies only, lace tablecloths, finger sandwiches, no one touched. She called it a tribute to refinement. I called it what it was: performance. She seated me at the far end of the table, next to Madison's college roommate and across from a woman I'd never met who spent 20 minutes describing her rescue poodles in fake French. I looked up the table toward Patricia. She was radiant in her cream blouse, pearls perfectly centered. She laughed too loudly. She didn't look at me once. When she raised her glass for a toast, she listed everyone by name. Her daughters, her nieces, the neighbor's wife. Everyone, except me. The woman beside me leaned over and whispered, "Which one are you again?" I smiled like it didn't sting. Like my face wasn't hot and my throat wasn't tight. "James's wife," I said. Oh, she nodded. "The designer." Right. That word used to feel like mine. Now it just felt like decoration, an accessory to soften the fact that I didn't come from their world. After dessert, I offered to help clean up. Patricia declined with her usual smile. "You've done enough, dear. Enjoy the sunshine." So I stood alone in the Morgan garden. The hedges were trimmed like soldiers. The roses too perfect to touch. I watched bees work harder than anyone else there. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through photos of last year's luncheon. There I was, arm in arm with Madison, laughing with someone's toddler on my lap. I remembered that version of me. Open, warm, willing. Now I wasn't even in this year's gallery. When I got home, I asked James, "Do you ever feel like I'm being phased out?" He looked up from his screen. Phased out. Like I'm invisible. Like I'm here but not really part of anything. He paused, then shrugged. "I think Mom's just traditional. You know how she is. It's not personal. But it was. It always had been. Only now she was no longer hiding it." And James, he'd gotten so used to the way things were that he stopped noticing how much I was shrinking to fit inside them. I wasn't sure what hurt more, being excluded, or watching him normalize it. The final sign came on a Sunday. We'd been invited to Patricia's for brunch, just the kids, she said. James insisted I come anyway. Don't make it a thing, he muttered, adjusting his cufflinks. So I did what I always did, smiled, dressed up, and showed up. The dining room smelled like fresh scones and roses. I brought a lemon tart. No one touched it. They were already halfway through mimosas and stories when we arrived. No extra place was set for me. Patricia blinked, then called to the kitchen. Could we grab one more plate? Just one. James sat beside his brother. They talked about the Seahawks remodeling plans, stock options. No one asked about my firm. No one mentioned the award I'd just received, top 50 women-led businesses in the West. I watched Patricia lean in toward Madison. Whisper. Laugh. Glance at me. I knew that look. It wasn't curiosity. It was amusement. As if I were a guest who'd overstayed. The clinking of silverware filled the silence where I should have belonged. When James offered to help clear the table, Patricia waved him off. You relax, darling. Let the girls handle it. The girls. Which did not include me. I stood in the kitchen alone, rinsing dishes I hadn't eaten from. The lemon tart sat untouched, perfectly intact, like a metaphor. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The Denver air through our cracked window felt colder than usual. James reached for me in his sleep fingers, brushing my arm like habit, not choice. And I thought about how quiet betrayal could be. Not loud like an affair, not explosive like lies, just invisible. Slow. Deliberate. Like being edited out of a life you helped write. One polite brunch at a time, one missing photo, one skipped introduction. The kind of betrayal that didn't leave bruises, just erasures. I wasn't angry. Not yet. But I was alert. And when a woman like me starts paying attention, really paying attention, it's only a matter of time before she stops waiting for a seat at the table and starts building her own. It was Patricia's 70th birthday. And as expected, it was an event, not a celebration. The invitation was Golden Boss sent weeks in advance, but not to me. I found out from a florist. She called my office to confirm a delivery, a lavish arrangement, roses, lilies, gardenias. Just making sure the card reads, "With love, Claire and James." I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't even been told about the party. I called James immediately. His voice was tight with distraction. Oh. Yeah, I was going to mention it. Madison handled everything. So I'm not going, I asked. He paused. It's mostly family and old business friends. You've been swamped lately with work, right? I stared out my office window at the Denver skyline, the same view I used to dream about when I worked from that tiny Boise loft. Now I had everything I once wished for except a place at the table. That night I sat in my studio, the one with warm oak floors and art from my first campaign, watching a live stream of the party. Yes, a live stream. Broadcast from Patricia's assistant's phone. Available for those who couldn't attend. The Four Seasons ballroom sparkled on screen. Crystal chandeliers, champagne towers, silk gowns in soft gold and navy. Madison glowed in emerald green. James stood beside his mother, all smiles and polished charm. The camera panned across the room, catching toasts, curated laughter, a 3-tier cake with sugar orchids. Then came the slideshow. I leaned in, heart already bracing. Photos of Patricia through the years. Vacations. Fundraisers. Backyard cookouts. Then the family montage. Her children as babies. Ski trips in Aspen. Family holidays in Cabo. Christmas mornings in the Seattle house. I waited for our wedding photo. Waited for the Thanksgiving I hosted when I cooked everything because the caterer canceled. Waited for the oil portrait I'd commissioned of the family 10 years ago. They never came. Slide after slide. Memory after memory. And not a single frame of me. Not even in the background, as if I hadn't existed. As if I'd never been part of this family at all. I watched the crowd applaud, watched James kiss his mother's cheek, watched the room shine with curated perfection. And I felt something inside me harden. Not rage. Not even sadness. Just a cold, precise awareness that I had been deliberately erased. And no one, not even my husband, had stopped it. The next morning, I opened the fridge and stared at a container of lemon yogurt James had bought just for me. I used to love that brand. Now it felt like a joke, like a peace offering from someone who didn't realize the war had already begun. He walked into the kitchen still in his tuxedo pants and undershirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "You didn't wait up," he said softly. "I watched the party," I replied. Livestream had excellent clarity. He froze. Then exhaled. "Claire." I didn't look at him. I spooned yogurt into a bowl. It tasted like chalk. "You were stunning," I said flatly. "Everyone looked so perfect." He leaned against the counter. "The event wasn't really about us. It was her night." "I noticed," I said. "Especially when us didn't exist in her slideshow." He hesitated. "She picked the photos." "I had nothing to do with that, but you watched them," I said. "You stood right there while I was erased." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I'd known since we were teenagers. It used to mean nervous excitement. Now it meant avoidance. "Claire," he murmured, "you know how she is." "Yeah," I said, sharper than I intended. "I do. And I know how you are when she's around." He flinched. I didn't apologize. I rinsed my bowl, placed it in the dishwasher, and felt the cold ceramic hum in my palm, more present than the man standing 5 feet from me. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He left for work. I turned off my phone. Instead of client calls, I organized old boxes in the hallway closet. Tucked inside was a forgotten album. Our early days. Moving into the Denver condo. James painting the kitchen ceiling shirtless. Me in overalls, laughing, flour on my cheek. Real. Unpolished. Unedited. I sat on the hallway floor with the album in my lap, and I realized something brutal. I hadn't changed. I'd evolved. Built. Given. But I hadn't erased anyone. I hadn't asked anyone to shrink for me to shine, and yet that's exactly what they'd done to me. Not with knives. Not with fights. With omissions. With silence. With careful, polite forgettings. I closed the album. My hands trembled slightly, but not from grief. It was clarity. Ruthless. Cold. But clean. I didn't want to scream. I wanted to understand. What had I let go of bit by bit so they could pretend I never mattered? And more importantly, what would I reclaim now that I knew? That weekend we had dinner at Madison's. It was supposed to be casual, just siblings and spouses. But the moment I stepped through the door, I felt it again. The pause. The polite smile. The empty seat at the far end of the table sat like an afterthought. I took my place and said nothing. No one asked me about my day. No one mentioned the campaign I'd launched that week. But everyone congratulated James on his wellness talk at the tech firm. He smiled modestly. Not once did he say Claire helped me shape it. Not once did he say she's the reason I learned to speak with clarity. I watched him from across the table. His cufflinks glinted in the candlelight. So did the distance in his eyes. Midway through dessert, Madison stood and tapped her glass. "I just want to thank everyone," she beamed. "For showing up for Mom this year. She really needed that. And James, your tribute speech made her cry. It was perfect." Applause. Even I clapped. Because I'd learned in their world appearance was everything. Noise meant truth, silence meant consent. And I was done being silent. When we got home, James loosened his tie. "Wasn't that nice?" he said, heading to the sink with the leftover cake Madison had packed for us. I stood in the kitchen doorway. "Do you really not see it?" I asked. He turned. "What, all of it?" I said. "How I'm never mentioned. How I'm removed one layer at a time." He exhaled. "Claire, not everything is a battle. But it's always a choice," I said. We stared at each other, not yelling, not crying. Just two people standing on opposite cliffs, pretending the gap wasn't growing wider. He looked tired. I felt awake. That night, I stayed up late. Opened my old sketchpad. Flipped through pages of ideas I once thought were too bold. Too loud. too unrefined. I wasn't going to fix them, I was going to finish them. Because I didn't want to be included anymore. I wanted to be undeniable. And to do that, I needed distance not just from Patricia but from the version of myself who kept asking to be chosen. The erasure was complete. Now it was my turn to redraw the lines. The snow came early that year. Denver turned pale before Thanksgiving, as if even the sky wanted to cover everything we didn't want to see. As if starting fresh meant erasing gently, quietly. I stood by the window in James's old flannel shirt, the one with the missing cuff button. He used to wear it when we painted this place, when we ordered Chinese at midnight, when we dreamed together. It used to smell like cedar and sleep. Now it smelled like detergent and nothing. Outside, neighborhood kids stumbled through the snow, laughing, tossing ice like glitter. I watched them for a while, not because I cared, but because they made noise. And our house didn't anymore. The kitchen was too clean. No sugar on the counter, no tea towels out of place. No signs of life. We used to fight over who got the last blueberry muffin. Now the muffins expired untouched in the pantry. I hadn't baked in months. Not even for myself. The silence had become routine. James left early, returned late, kissed my cheek like muscle memory. When we talked, it was about groceries, invoices, whether the gutters had been cleared, nothing that touched the skin. I once placed a bold new campaign draft on the kitchen table. It was raw, emotional, the kind of work that once lit a spark in his eyes. He walked past it, didn't even flinch. "Are we out of oat milk?" was all he said. And I stood there holding that draft, like a child with a broken toy, still hoping someone would notice. That was the moment. Not the slideshow, not the birthday, not even the brunch. The moment he didn't see my work, didn't see me, was when I realized I could fade in this house inch by inch until even I couldn't find myself. I started waking up earlier than usual. Not out of discipline or ambition, but because the morning silence was easier to carry than the disappointment that arrived by nightfall. I'd sit in the kitchen with my coffee, watch the steam curl upward like smoke from something quietly burning. The chair across from me stayed empty. His mug stayed clean. There was no fight, no slammed doors or cruel words. Just the weight of nothing. That's what no one warns you about. Sometimes the thing that breaks you isn't the betrayal, but the absence of acknowledgement. I tried to fill my days with structure: client calls, design revisions, social media campaigns. From the outside, everything looked sharp, controlled, but inside I felt like a placeholder in my own body, going through motions that no longer fed me. The hardest part wasn't that James stopped seeing me, it was that I'd started accepting it. Started adapting to smallness. I stopped wearing lipstick. Stopped styling my hair. Not in rebellion, but because no one noticed when I did. I took long showers just to feel something warm against my skin. Sometimes I'd cry, not in sobs, just slow, tired tears that vanished down the drain before I could count them. At night, I'd lie beside James and listen to him breathe. Steady. Undisturbed. He still held me out of habit. His arm would drape across my waist like a memory. And I let him. Because even the illusion of closeness was better than facing how far we'd drifted. We didn't argue. We didn't reconnect. We just maintained. Like tenants in a quiet lease neither of us had the courage to break. One night I asked him softly, "Are you happy?" He blinked at the ceiling. Then turned to me and said, "I'm fine. Fine." It was the saddest thing he could have said. Because it told me everything I feared. We weren't falling apart, we'd already fallen, and neither of us noticed the impact when we hit the ground. We just learned to keep walking on the rubble, pretending it was still home. I started sleeping in the guest room. At first it was just for a night. I told James I had a migraine. He nodded, kissed my forehead absently, and rolled over. But then it became routine. Like so many things between us, quiet, unspoken, habitual. I brought my pillow. Then my journal. Then my charger. Eventually, I stopped going back. The guest room was smaller, colder, but at least the silence was mine. No shared sighs. No pretending. One night, I caught my reflection in the mirror by the closet. My hair was undone. My face was bare. But I didn't look broken. I looked, still. And for the first time in months, I realized how tired I was of negotiating for space in my own life. Everything I'd built, every dollar, every campaign, every silent sacrifice had been folded into someone else's story. Made smaller. Muted. I hadn't stopped loving James, but I had stopped loving who I became beside him. And love that costs you your voice isn't love. It's erasure with a smile. I made a list that night. Things I missed: laughing until my stomach hurt, taking risks without asking permission. My studio at midnight, feeling proud without explaining why. Speaking without shrinking. By the time I capped my pen, I knew the truth. I hadn't lost everything, but I was dangerously close. One more omission. One more party. One more night of being invisible. And there'd be nothing left to come back for. I folded the list into my journal, slid it under my pillow, closed my eyes, and made a quiet promise to the woman I used to be: I see you. And I'm coming back. Not to fight, not to beg, but to remember who you were before they taught you to disappear. The day I made the call, the sky in Denver was slate gray, the kind that holds back snow but makes no promises. I sat in my office, door closed, blinds drawn. The familiar hum of my space grounded me: leather chairs, white oak shelves, mood board pinned with Pantone swatches and scribbled goals. I stared at the name in my contacts: Margot Ellis, attorney. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since I helped brand her firm when she went solo. But she'd always told me, if you ever need quiet power, I'm your girl. And that morning I needed quiet power. I tapped the call icon. Her voice came through, steady, low, no fluff. Claire, I've been expecting you. I almost laughed. Of course she had. We met 2 days later at a cafe off Cherry Creek. I wore sunglasses, though it was cloudy. Habit, maybe. Maybe shame. Margot didn't waste time. You don't need to sue anyone, she said, but you do need to protect what's yours. I told her everything: the erasures, the silence, the accounts I hadn't checked in months. She listened, took notes, didn't pity me. When I finished, she asked one question: is this about leaving him or reclaiming you? I paused. I'm not sure there's a difference anymore. She nodded slowly. That's when you know it's real. Afterward, I walked for blocks, hands in my coat pocket, head bare to the cold. Every step felt heavier, but also more mine. I passed a bridal shop. Their window display still featured my old logo. I designed it 6 years ago, back when I thought legacy meant permanence. Now I understood legacy wasn't what lasted. It was what you chose to carry forward. That same week, I requested a full audit of our joint financials. Not because I didn't trust James, but because I finally realized I didn't trust the silence between us. The private banker met me in a glass room on the 15th floor. The view stretched across downtown Denver, all sharp angles and winter haze. But I wasn't looking outside. I was watching the screen. Line by line. Statement by statement. Expenses I hadn't approved. Transfers I hadn't made. Contributions to a trust I didn't recognize. Claire, the banker said, voice careful. These funds, they've been restructured under James's name as primary. Some of the secondary access has changed over the past year. I didn't blink. It wasn't fraud. It was control, quiet, legal, deliberate. Signed documents I never read closely. Permissions granted in moments of trust. Favors done just to simplify things. It was all so neat, so polite, so entirely intentional. When I left, I didn't cry. I walked to the parking garage, sat in my car, and stared at the wheel like it belonged to someone else. I thought about the years. The dinners I skipped to finalize contracts. The holidays I covered so Patricia could have a full table. The client retreat I postponed for James's cousin's wedding. I'd paid, I'd given. And now my name was a courtesy on accounts I had built. On the drive home, I turned off the radio. I needed the silence to listen to myself think. Could I confront him? Yes. But would it change anything? He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't lie. He'd shrug. He'd say, "Claire, it's not what you think." Or worse, I thought we were a team, but we weren't. A team shares, respects, checks in. What we had now was a polite arrangement with good lighting and no weight-bearing walls. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for 10 minutes. Watching our house glow warm from the outside, it looked perfect. Lived in, safe. And I didn't believe any of it, because for the first time I saw the architecture for what it was: pretty quiet and built to keep me exactly where they needed me to stay. That night, I didn't bring it up. James came home late, loosened his tie, and kissed my cheek with the same absence he always did. I stood at the stove stirring pasta I didn't plan to eat. He poured himself wine. Asked how my day was. I said fine. We both lied. I waited until he was in the shower, then opened the safe in the study. The passcode hadn't changed his birthday. I took my original business contracts, my design archives, the original copy of the prenup. I scanned every page, uploaded them to my private cloud. Marked the folder Morgan Legacy, Truth Copy. Then I logged into my personal account, the one under my maiden name. The one I hadn't touched in 5 years. Balance $78, 240.13. Not much, but enough for first steps. I didn't feel fear. I felt calm. Like watching a fire you didn't start finally burn itself out. I slept in the guest room again. Didn't dream, didn't flinch when I heard him walking past the door at midnight. In the morning, I packed a small suitcase. Just enough for a week. He watched me from the doorway, eyes tired. "Business trip?" he asked. I zipped the bag slowly, something like that. "Do you want me to drop you off?" I looked at him, really looked at the man I once built a life with. "No," I said softly. "I need to drive this one myself." He didn't press. Didn't ask where or why. Just nodded. As if he sensed something was shifting but didn't dare name it. And that was the problem. So much went unsaid in our house of polite silences and fading photographs. I left the lemon tart from Madison in the fridge. Untouched. Still pristine. Like the version of me they all preferred: silent, sweet, and sealed. As I pulled onto the highway, the clouds above Denver began to break. A narrow sliver of sun split through the gray. It wasn't much. But it was enough to remind me that escape didn't need an audience. Only a decision. Would you go public or stay silent and walk away on your own terms? The first thing I noticed in Maui wasn't the ocean. It was the silence. Not the kind that isolates, but the kind that welcomes. The kind that feels like someone finally turned off the noise you didn't realize you'd been living with. I stepped onto the porch of the bungalow I bought 5 years ago. At the time, it was just an investment. A vague maybe someday. Now it was the only place that felt mine. The key still worked. The air inside was faintly sweet, like salt old cedar and dried plumeria. It smelled like pause. Like space. I stood barefoot on the tile floor, letting the breeze from the open windows move across my skin. There were no chandeliers. No curated floral arrangements. No family portraits on the wall with people who smiled through gritted teeth. Just light. Wood. And the sound of birds I didn't need to impress. I didn't tell James I was coming, didn't leave a note. Didn't forward the flight confirmation. This was my clean break. The beginning of something that didn't require approval or compromise. I unpacked slowly. Only essentials. A soft linen dress. 2 sketchbooks, a portable hard drive with everything I'd built. And 1 folder creased but intact. Private, foundation drafts. That night I slept with the windows open. No streetlights, no humming refrigerator. Only the ocean, low, constant, ancient. I fell asleep without dreaming, and woke up to my own breath, steady. The next morning I brewed coffee. No machine, just a ceramic pour-over. I watched it drip slowly into the mug I'd bought at a flea market in Hilo. It tasted honest. Then I opened my laptop. 1 email blinking, campaign 6 live, already trending. I smiled. They didn't need me in Denver. Because I had built something real, a team, a brand, a legacy that didn't depend on anyone's last name. I pulled out a notepad and began writing line by line. Convert firm to fully remote. Freeze access to all joint funds. Retitle assets under Claire Whitman LLC. Contact accountant. Reclaim every single document. Quiet exit. No announcement, just absence. It wasn't revenge. It was recovery. It was dignity finally speaking its own name through action, not apology. By the third day, I stopped checking the time. I let the sun tell me when to stretch, when to walk barefoot down to the beach, when to open my laptop and make decisions without asking anyone's opinion. There's a power in silence, not the kind that punishes, but the kind that allows. I called my assistant Lydia, told her to cancel all in-person meetings through the end of the quarter. She didn't ask why. She simply replied, already done. Want me to forward mail to Maui? It hit me then. Someone in my life still saw me as whole. That afternoon I sat under the shade of a breadfruit tree, journal in my lap, pen in hand. I wasn't writing plans this time. I was writing memory. I listed every moment I had handed over a piece of myself. The time I changed my business name to sound more neutral. The nights I skipped sketching to play hostess. The campaign I gave to James's cousin because he needed a win. The apology I made to Patricia after her comment about working-class perfume. One by one I named them, labeled them, and with every line I felt lighter. Not angry, just released. The sun moved. So did I. I walked back inside and stood before the mirror in the hallway. The same mirror that once made me feel too much, too assertive, too loud, too ungraceful. This time I saw a woman who had learned the art of quiet refusal. A woman who had traded approval for alignment. And didn't regret it. Later that night, I called Margot. I'm ready, I told her. For what? To stop asking for the space I already own. We scheduled the next steps. Asset protection. A formal notice of financial separation. Letters to clients explaining the new direction of my firm, still thriving, just freer. I ended the call. Didn't cry, didn't exhale too deeply. There was no need. This wasn't a storm, it was the eye of one. And I had built shelter out of my own decisions. On the fifth day, I stopped checking my phone. Not because I didn't care what James might say, but because I already knew he wouldn't. No missed calls. No unread texts. Just silence, the same kind he'd always offered in place of effort. And that silence no longer hurt. It confirmed. In the stillness of the morning, I printed the letters. All 12. One for James. One for each of the accounts he forgot I had access to. One for each of the clients we both pretended were shared. One final letter for myself, just 3 lines. You were never crazy. You were never small. You were never theirs to shrink. I folded them carefully, sealed them in separate envelopes, and placed them in a leather folio I'd kept since Boise. Worn, reliable, mine. I spent the afternoon scanning documents, backing up contracts, and confirming the trust account Patricia had tried to dissolve was still under my name. It was. Quiet justice doesn't need headlines, it needs paperwork, proof, and patience. By sunset, I sat at the edge of the porch watching the tide pull out, slowly revealing the dark rocks underneath. It struck me healing isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's jagged, exposed, but necessary. I hadn't run away. I had regrouped. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was preparing release. James hadn't reached out, but the family's group chat, yes, I still had access, was still buzzing. Photos of brunch. Birthday plans. Patricia's fundraiser. No one mentioned me. No one asked where I'd gone. They had made peace with my absence before I even confirmed it. Good. That meant I was free to leave without protest. I closed the laptop, locked the folio, and set an early alarm. Tomorrow I would fly back to Denver. Not to argue, not to plead, but to pack. And when I left that house, the one with the granite countertops and silence-lined walls, I wouldn't look back. Because closure doesn't always come in the form of apology. Sometimes it's just you, a suitcase, and a front door that you choose to shut for the very last time. When I landed back in Denver, the air felt thinner than I remembered. Sharp, drier. Like the altitude had changed. Or maybe I had. I didn't go home right away. I drove downtown. Walked into the bank branch where I'd opened my first business account. The marble floors were still too cold, the receptionist still too polished. The manager recognized me immediately. He smiled professionally. Asked if I wanted water. I declined. He slid the documents across the table. Account separations. Trust restructures. Revocation of secondary access. Everything was clean. Final. Bulletproof. I signed in quiet strokes. Claire Whitman. Each letter deliberate. The last time I signed as Morgan was for a family birthday card I was never thanked for. When I left the building, I paused outside, watched a couple holding hands pass by. They looked unremarkable, but connected. I couldn't remember the last time James had reached for me in public, or even looked at me like I belonged to the moment. From there, I drove toward the house I used to call ours. The front porch still had the fall wreath I'd hung 2 months before. The flowers I planted were now brittle from frost, a metaphor that felt a little too on the nose. I stepped inside. The air smelled of lemon cleaner and lavender spray. James always tried to make the house smell like effort when he knew he hadn't offered any. It looked exactly the same. But it didn't feel like mine. It hadn't for a long time. I walked slowly through each room, letting my eyes land where they used to linger. The dining table where I once hosted Thanksgiving alone. The hallway mirror that always made me question my posture. The bathroom drawer still filled with my skincare, but none of it used. I opened the closet and packed with precision. Not everything, just what mattered. The jacket I wore on my first client pitch. My sketchbooks. 2 worn t-shirts that still smelled like confidence. In the study, I placed 2 envelopes on the desk. No bows. No drama. Just truth. And then I removed my wedding ring, slipped it off like a breath I'd been holding for too long, and placed it on the kitchen island. Centered. Alone. Quiet. Just like I'd felt for years. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ring on the island. It didn't sparkle in that house lighting, it just sat there. Heavy with everything unsaid. The ring was never really about love. Not in this house. It was about place. About visibility. Patricia once complimented it not because it was elegant but because it was substantial. Her word, not mine. "You'll never be overlooked with that on your finger," she'd said, smiling like she owned the diamond. But I had been overlooked. Ring or not. I walked through the living room, past the gallery wall of curated photos. They hadn't changed in years. Not a single frame showed me laughing. Just stiff smiles. Pale dresses. Composition over connection. I reached the kitchen table, ran my hand across its surface. That table had once been a place of late-night Thai food storyboarding new launches, with James marking margins with red pen and passing coffee back and forth during final reviews. Now it held nothing. Just a fruit bowl with 2 perfect green apples, untouched like most things in that house. Upstairs, I checked the guest room, my room now. The bed still unmade from the day I left. My pillow still indented. The air was stale. I opened the window, let the cold in. Then I gathered the rest: a few books, the jade ring from my father, a small framed photo of me in Boise barefoot on my office floor back when joy didn't need to be scheduled. On my way out, I stopped in front of Patricia's Christmas gift box, a porcelain vase I had custom made with her mother's initials engraved. Still unopened. I didn't take it personally. I took it as proof. People show you who they are. You just have to stop editing their story. Before locking up, I left one final thing in the hallway closet, a note taped to the back wall behind the coats. This home had a chance to be something soft. You chose sharp edges. I chose the door, no signature. If they found it, they'd know. If they didn't, even more telling. Then I shut the door. No slam. No pause. Just a woman who knew that sometimes justice doesn't come from being heard. It comes from no longer explaining yourself at all. I drove away without music. No radio. No podcasts. Just the sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional turn signal clicking like a metronome. The city passed by my window gray buildings, bare trees, the winter kind of quiet that feels more like waiting than stillness. I didn't cry. Not from relief. Not from grief. Just silence. My own. Chosen. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. No mascara, no earrings, just a face I recognized again. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. At the next intersection, my phone lit up. James. One missed call, then another. Then a text. "Where are you?" I didn't respond. He wasn't asking for me. He was asking for the version of me that stayed. The version that waited to be seen. But that woman was no longer available. I turned off the phone. Slid it into the glove box. Felt the weight lift an inch higher off my chest. By the time I reached the post office, the letters were already in my hand. 12 envelopes. Labeled. Stamped. Sequenced. I dropped them into the slot one by one like laying bricks for a path behind me. Then I walked out hands empty for the first time in years. Outside, the wind picked up, not cruel, just crisp. It reminded me that seasons don't ask for permission to change. They just do. That night I didn't stay at a hotel. I stayed in a short-term rental on the edge of town. Concrete floors, big windows. No framed memories. I made tea. Ate toast. Saturday, cross-legged on the rug with my sketchbook in my lap. And for the first time in a long time, my hand moved across the page without hesitation. I didn't draw a logo. Didn't plan a campaign. I drew the vase from Patricia's shelf, the one she never opened. Cracked it down the middle. Let something bloom from inside it. It wasn't perfect. But it was mine. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. Packed light. Tied my hair back. And stood in the doorway with nothing to ask for. Because I wasn't seeking approval anymore. I was writing the final line to a chapter that was already finished. 6 weeks after I left, I woke to birdsong instead of alarms. No meetings, no cold coffee. No calendar invites waiting to steal my breath. Just light soft and gold spilling across the floorboards of the bungalow in Maui. The same boards I once saw as escape now simply felt like home. The first 2 weeks had been about silence. Rebuilding the rhythm of waking, eating, moving. For me. Not for approval, not for duty. Just for living. Some nights I still jolted awake half expecting James's voice, saying, "We're late," or the ping of Patricia's group chat buzzing with obligations. But the silence that followed wasn't hollow anymore. It was mine. I had donated half my wardrobe. Sold the car in Denver. Kept only what I could carry and what carried meaning. I didn't need more. I just needed room to breathe without being resized. I bought local fruit from women at the pier who didn't care what I used to be. I swam in the ocean at noon without explaining my to-do list. I slept when I was tired, worked when I felt called, and forgave myself when I didn't feel like producing anything at all. One morning I took out the sketch Claire Morgan would have never pitched. Not because it wasn't good, but because it was too bold, too feminine, too personal. It was a campaign built around middle-aged women. Not polished or plastic, but real, with laugh lines, silver streaks, and hands that had held grief and grown gardens. I submitted it under a new LLC, the Whitman Collective. No partners, no sponsors. Just a message. We are not less because we are later in the story. We are deeper. The next week, an editor from a West Coast magazine called. She had tears in her voice. "I felt seen," she said. "No one builds for us. They build past us." That's when I knew my life hadn't collapsed. It had finally outgrown its container. One afternoon I received an email, subject line, "Update on Morgan Family Trust." I almost deleted it. But curiosity nudged. It was from their new attorney. Brief. Formal. Apparently Patricia had fallen ill after a minor stroke. James had been appointed co-executor of the family trust. They were revisiting asset division and looking for legacy guidance. Legacy. The very thing they once told me I'd never understand. There was a note at the end. If you'd like to submit a personal statement or proposal, the family is open to inclusion. Inclusion. After I left. After they cleared the photos. After they forgot to invite me to the table, I stared at the screen for 10 full minutes. Then closed the laptop. Because here's the truth. You don't have to sit at a table that only notices your absence. You can build your own. And I had 3 designers under my wing now, all women over 40. All brilliant. All previously told they were past their prime. We met once a week over pineapple tea and bare feet, shared stories. Launched quiet revolutions. I didn't respond to the Morgan email, not because I was angry, but because it no longer belonged to my story. And that might be the deepest kind of healing, the moment when you realize you don't need them to see you to know that you exist fully. That you matter. That you've already left your mark by choosing not to chase theirs. The day of the launch, I didn't wear heels, I wore sandals, the soft kind that let your feet feel the ground beneath them. The kind that remind you you're still here. Still held. We didn't rent a ballroom. No event planner, no gold foil signage. No hashtags. We met in an open-air studio by the ocean. Sliding wooden doors. Salt air drifting in without needing to be invited. Hibiscus blooming wild along the edge of the stone path, refusing to be trimmed into anyone's expectations. At the center of the space, we set one long table, reclaimed koa wood worn smooth by years and storms. We didn't decorate it, we let the grain show. The women arrived early, one by one. No one asked where they'd come from. We all came from the same place, really from being ignored, flattened, overlooked in rooms we once helped build. They were brilliant, sharp. Soft in the best kind of way. A former creative director who'd left the agency world because they stopped hearing me after 45. A branding consultant who went gray on purpose. A midwife who now advises wellness companies on what women actually need after 40. None of them introduced themselves with titles. Only with what they were making now. We called it the collective. There were no rules. Only one promise. We do not shrink here. I opened the morning with a sentence I had never said out loud before. Most of us have spent our lives shrinking to fit rooms that never deserved us. The wind paused. Or maybe it didn't. But the silence that followed felt holy. Some eyes welled up. Not from sadness. From recognition. From remembering what it had cost to be palatable. Then I told them everything. About the ring. The kitchen. The group chat that slowly forgot my name. And how I left, not to be dramatic but to be whole. They didn't interrupt. They didn't rush to console. They listened like it was their own story being unzipped. And maybe that's what healing is, not applause. But finally being met. Afterward, a woman with silver braids touched my hand. Her voice low. Steady. My daughter's watching, she said, and I needed this, so I can show her how to stay full. After the event, I stayed back to sweep the leaves off the stone steps. Not because I had to, but because it felt grounding to tend to a space that didn't ask me to earn my place. The air was thick with salt and ginger blossoms. My hands smelled like citrus from the tea glasses. Every small detail felt vivid again, like my senses had finally unclenched. Lydia, my assistant-turned-partner, lingered behind. She stood beside me, quietly holding the clipboard we never opened. You know, she said, there's something powerful about not needing permission to begin. I looked at her. She wasn't just confident, she was becoming, and so was I. Later that evening, we sat on the porch with our feet propped up. No wine. Just water with mint and silence. The kind that didn't ache anymore. I watched the women leave one by one. Some with tears still caught in their lashes. Some smiling like someone had just handed them back a forgotten name. I didn't need to debrief. Didn't need to assess metrics. Because when healing happens in real time, you don't measure it, you feel it, and I did. All of it, the release. The reclamation. The soft revolution happening beneath the surface. I thought about James briefly. Wondered if he ever walked past the kitchen counter and saw the ring still lying there untouched. I imagined Patricia opening the letter, rereading the words. Not out of guilt, she was too practiced for that. But maybe out of confusion. Because women like me weren't supposed to leave quietly. We were supposed to stay, complain, then compromise. But I had rewritten the script, and they couldn't predict the ending anymore. Sometimes the greatest justice isn't in revenge. It's in removal. Sometimes the loudest echo is the space where your silence used to be filled by proving. Now I was just living. Making things. Holding space. Not waiting to be witnessed, but witnessing myself. The world hadn't changed. But my relationship to it had. And maybe that was the real legacy, not in what I left behind, but in what I finally chose to hold close. That night the stars came out early. The kind of sky that doesn't ask for an audience, it just shines. I sat alone on the back steps of the bungalow, knees pulled to my chest, watching the horizon fade into a charcoal blue I'd never seen before. No notifications. No calendar. No curated life pressing down on my chest. Just me. And the quiet. And the truth that had taken years to peel back. I wasn't healing anymore. I had healed, not perfectly. Not dramatically. But completely enough to not need anyone's permission to call it done. Behind me the house was still. Not empty, just full of the kind of peace that no one could buy or fake. A breeze moved through the palms. Soft. Patient. Like the version of me I had become. I pulled out my notebook. Not to plan. Just to write what I wanted to remember. I wrote. There are some things I'll never get back: the years I spent trying to belong in a family that measured worth by legacy instead of love, the words I swallowed to stay palatable, the pauses I filled with labor they never noticed. But there are things I have now that I wouldn't trade for anything: clarity, self-respect, quiet mornings, and the ability to choose when and how I show up in my own life. I closed the notebook gently. Pressed my palm to the cover. Felt my pulse there. Still strong. Still mine. The next morning, I walked down to the ocean alone. Not to perform. Not to photograph. Just to stand in the water and feel it touch my skin without taking anything from me. The tide moved over my ankles. Cold at first, then familiar. I closed my eyes. In the distance, I could hear children laughing. Women talking. The sound of a new day that didn't require my sacrifice to keep turning. And I smiled because that's what I had learned most in the end. That you don't have to burn yourself down to be light for others. You can be soft, you can be seen, you can be sovereign. You can be a woman who writes her name in places no one expected her to last, and then stays there not to prove but to build. I turned back toward the shore. My feet left wet marks on the sand. They wouldn't last. The ocean would take them like it always did. But that didn't matter anymore. Because the mark I had come here to leave wasn't on the sand, it was on myself. And maybe that's where legacy really begins, not with who remembers you, but with what you remember about yourself once you've finally stopped trying to be remembered. That night, I wrote one final letter, not to James. Not to Patricia. Not to the world. To myself. Dear Claire, you didn't disappear, you dissolved what no longer deserved to hold you. You didn't burn bridges, you built your own island. You didn't lose your place, you reclaimed your name. And that is enough. Signed. The woman you became when you finally stopped asking for space. I folded the letter, placed it in a small tin box, and buried it beneath the plumeria tree outside the studio. A soft grave for the version of me who waited too long. A new route for the one who now plants her own future. Would you have done the same? Would you have walked not to escape but to become? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever made you feel invisible, and what did you do next? Share your truth below. You never know who's waiting to exhale. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more stories of quiet strength, emotional closure, and women who rewrite their ending on their own terms.